At exactly 2:17 a.m., Poland woke to a nightmare. 19 drones, launched from across the border, tore through the sky. Their target: critical infrastructure, fuel depots, and supply hubs. By dawn, NATO had already convened an emergency meeting. For the first time since the Cold War, the alliance faced the possibility of direct war on European soil. But then, this isn't the first time Europe has lived in the shadow of a looming war. To understand why NATO's eastern flank is now the world's most dangerous frontline, we need to step back in time to an era where the world was divided by iron and fire. Because what is happening in Poland today is a haunting echo of the Cold War. This is no fairy tale, this is real history unfolding before your eyes. But before we continue, we need your support. Hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support keeps this story alive. The Cold War wasn't born in an instant. It was forged in the ashes of World War II. When Nazi Germany fell, two superpowers emerged from the rubble: the United States and the Soviet Union. Allies in victory, but rivals in ideology. On one side, Washington promised democracy, open markets, and a free world. On the other, Moscow pushed socialism, centralized power, and expansion through force. The West feared Stalin's ambitions in Europe. The Soviets feared encirclement by capitalist enemies. Suspicion turned to hostility. Hostility turned to an arms race. The Cold War had begun. But instead of peace, Europe became a chessboard, carved in half by the Iron Curtain. And Poland was caught right in the middle. For centuries, Poland has been Europe's tragic crossroads, invaded by Germans, Russians, Austrians. After World War II, Stalin refused to let Poland slip away. The country was chained to the Soviet bloc, its territory a launch pad for Moscow's armies. In NATO war rooms, Poland wasn't seen as a nation. It was seen as the first domino. If the Soviets struck west, Poland would be the highway of invasion. But history has flipped. Today, Poland is no longer the staging ground for Moscow. It is the shield of NATO, and that makes it target number one. During the Cold War, the world lived one heartbeat away from annihilation. At its peak, the Soviet Union fielded nearly 50,000 tanks across Eastern Europe. NATO, in response, deployed nuclear artillery, supersonic fighters, and secret doomsday plans. The most feared flashpoint? The Fulda Gap in West Germany. NATO generals believed that if the Red Army charged west, that narrow valley would become World War III's opening battlefield. Every day, soldiers trained for a war that never came. A war of tanks, missiles, and nuclear fire. A war that haunted every child hiding under a classroom desk during atomic drills. But today, history has a cruel sense of irony. The Cold War arsenal may be gone, but the shadow of its destruction lives on. And once again, Europe trembles on the edge. Because as Poland burns tonight, NATO is asking, is this the new Fulda Gap? The 19 drones that struck Poland weren't just an attack on fuel depots. They were a message. Russia's mobilization inside Belarus has turned the country into a forward operating base. A dagger pointed straight at NATO's heart. For NATO commanders, this is déjà vu. During the Cold War, the Warsaw Pact kept thousands of missiles stationed in Eastern Europe, aimed directly at NATO capitals. Today, the names have changed, but the strategy is the same. Pressure the East, test NATO's resolve, push until the alliance cracks. And here's the danger. NATO has promised that an attack on one is an attack on all. If Russia miscalculates, if one drone crosses the wrong line, the alliance will have no choice but to respond. And once NATO responds, the spiral toward war may be unstoppable. Ukraine was supposed to be the buffer. Russia's invasion in 2022 was meant to redraw Europe's borders and terrify NATO. But instead, it backfired. NATO grew stronger. Ukraine resisted with Western weapons, and Russia's army bled in the fields of Bakhmut and Kherson. But Putin has not given up. By striking Poland, he is testing NATO the same way he tested Ukraine, with drones, with deniability, with hybrid war. And just like in 1939, Poland once again stands at the crossroads of history. And this time, the United States is watching with fury. For Washington, this is more than an attack on Poland. It is a direct challenge to the credibility of NATO itself. If Article 5, the Mutual Defense Clause, is ignored, NATO collapses. And America knows it. Washington had previously vowed that they would defend every inch of NATO territory. During the Cold War, America stationed 500,000 troops in Europe to deter the Soviet Union. Today, the numbers are smaller, but the message is the same. An attack on NATO will not go unanswered. But how far is NATO prepared to go? And what would that war even look like? To answer that, we must return to the beginning, to the Cold War itself, because the weapons built then are still shaping the war we may fight tomorrow. But before then, if you have not subscribed to our channel, please like, and subscribe to our channel, thank you. In 1945, they stood as brothers in arms. The United States and the Soviet Union had fought side by side to crush Nazi Germany. Their soldiers embraced, their leaders toasted victory. But beneath the surface, suspicion was already boiling. The Soviets wanted buffer zones, nations they could dominate to prevent another German invasion. The Americans wanted open markets and democracy in Europe. Both sides wanted security. Neither trusted the other. The phrase stuck. The Iron Curtain wasn't just a metaphor. It was a line of barbed wire, tanks, and watchtowers splitting Europe in two. On one side, the Soviet bloc. On the other, the West. And that curtain would soon become the front line of the longest standoff in history. If there was a single city that captured the Cold War's birth, it was Berlin. Divided into 4 zones, it became the test case of East versus West. In 1948, Stalin cut off all road and rail access to West Berlin. 2 million civilians were trapped, surrounded by Soviet-controlled territory. The West responded with the Berlin airlift. For nearly a year, Allied pilots flew supplies around the clock, more than 200,000 flights. Stalin blinked. The blockade failed. But the message was clear. Europe was no longer at peace. And out of this crisis, NATO itself was born. On April 4th, 1949, 12 nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty. Their promise was simple, but revolutionary. If one member was attacked, all would respond. Collective defense, Article 5. For Moscow, this was an act of aggression. For Washington, it was a necessity. Without it, Europe could fall one by one to Soviet pressure. With it, the West had drawn a red line. For the first time in history, America committed itself to permanent military defense of Europe. And with NATO's creation, the Cold War's 2 camps were now official. But a treaty alone could not stop tanks and missiles. Weapons would decide this struggle. America believed it had the ultimate trump card, the atomic bomb. In 1945, it was the only nuclear power on Earth. But just 4 years later, the Soviets tested their own bomb. The monopoly was gone. The arms race had begun. Let's see how these 2 superpowers built up their arsenals, weapons that could change the course of history. In the year 1945, 2 bombs, U.S. 1950, 369 bombs, U.S., 5 USSR. 1960, thousands each. Each side raced not just for more weapons, but for deadlier ones. Hydrogen bombs, long-range bombers, intercontinental missiles. For the first time in history, mankind had the power to end itself in a single day. And that fear would dominate every decision NATO and the Soviet Union made. But nuclear fire was only half the story. The Cold War would also be fought with armies poised across Europe, waiting for the order to strike. In the 1950s, NATO and the Warsaw Pact began stockpiling weapons on a scale the world had never seen. The Soviets rolled out their new T-54 tanks, sleek jet fighters like the MiG-15, and artillery by the tens of thousands. NATO countered with American M47 Patton tanks, British Centurions, and the first jet bombers capable of carrying nuclear payloads. Every exercise, every parade was a show of strength, designed not just to defend, but to intimidate. And Poland? Once again, it was the front line. Soviet divisions were stationed across its fields, ready to pour west at a moment's notice. And NATO generals knew if the Red Army moved, they might not be able to stop it without going nuclear. Faced with Soviet superiority in conventional forces, NATO developed a terrifying strategy. It was called massive retaliation. If the Red Army invaded, NATO would not fight tank for tank. It would answer with nuclear weapons, instantly, massively, without hesitation. This was the logic of the Cold War. It wasn't about winning a battle. It was about convincing the other side that starting one was suicide. But strategies based on fear are always fragile. One miscalculation, one wrong move, and the world could end overnight. And just as NATO embraced nuclear fire, the Soviets prepared their own counter, building an empire of satellites and armies ready to strike. To lock down Eastern Europe, Stalin turned half the continent into a military fortress. In 1955, he created the Warsaw Pact, a counter-alliance to NATO. Its members? East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and most importantly, Poland. Suddenly, NATO faced not just the Soviet Union, but an entire block of satellite armies. And for Poland, this meant more Soviet tanks, more missiles, more soldiers stationed on its soil, ready for war that might never come. And so, the world settled into a new reality, peace that was not peace, war that was not war, a Cold War. But even as this fragile balance formed, cracks were already appearing, and the Cold War would soon explode into crises that nearly destroyed the world. The Cold War had begun in fear, but its weapons, the tanks, the bombers, the nukes, would evolve into nightmares of steel and fire. To understand NATO's strength today, we must first understand the arsenal it was born from. The Cold War was not fought with speeches alone. It was fought with arsenals, vast, terrifying arsenals. Across the plains of Europe, two military machines prepared for a war they prayed would never come. For NATO, the challenge was clear. The Soviet Union commanded the largest army on Earth. By the 1970s, it could deploy over 50,000 tanks, more than all of NATO combined. If war broke out, those tanks would pour across the border in a tidal wave of steel, and NATO's generals knew there was only one place they might be able to stop them. That place was the Fulda Gap, a narrow valley in central Germany, just 60 miles from Frankfurt. To NATO, it was the soft underbelly of Europe, the perfect invasion route. Every NATO war game began here. Could the U.S. 7th Army and its allies hold the line? Or would Soviet tanks crush them within days? According to General William Depew's quote, "We never thought we could stop them without nuclear weapons." The Fulda Gap was more than a battlefield. It was a symbol, the trigger point where Cold War tensions could ignite into World War III. But NATO's plan to stop the Red Army was even more terrifying than the invasion itself. Outnumbered in tanks and men, NATO adopted a chilling doctrine: the nuclear tripwire. If Soviet forces crossed into Western Europe, NATO would unleash nuclear weapons, not on Moscow, but on the battlefield itself. Atomic shells, short-range rockets, even nuclear landmines buried beneath German soil. The idea was simple. If the Soviets advanced, they would march straight into nuclear fire. But there was a problem. Once the first nuclear weapon was used, who could stop the next? Where did limited war end and total destruction begin? And that question would haunt every NATO commander for the next 40 years. The Cold War wasn't only fought on the ground. It reached the skies. For NATO, strategic bombers like the B-52 became the backbone of nuclear deterrence, capable of striking Moscow within hours. The Soviets countered with their own fleet, the Tu-95 Bear, the Tu-22 Blinder, escorted by swarms of MiGs. Every day, NATO and Soviet bombers tested each other's borders, coming within minutes of triggering war. A single miscalculation, a single nervous trigger finger, and the skies over Europe could have turned into a nuclear graveyard. But the Cold War arsenal didn't stop at bombers. The true terror came from the silent missiles hidden in forests, seas, and silos. By the 1960s, bombers were no longer enough. The superpowers raced to deploy ballistic missiles. weapons that could cross continents in minutes. Soviet SS-20 stationed in Eastern Europe, targeting NATO capitals. U.S. Minuteman ICBMs in underground silos. Submarines carrying Polaris missiles hidden beneath the seas. For NATO cities, this meant death could arrive with no warning. London, Paris, Bonn, all within 15 minutes of a Soviet launch. In the 1980s, NATO deployed Pershing 2 missiles to counter the Soviet SS-20s. The Soviets called them a first-strike weapon. Europe called them a death sentence. Protests filled the streets, but the missiles stayed. And through it all, Poland remained the launch pad of Moscow's missiles, its fields hiding the rockets meant for Western Europe. Beneath the oceans, an invisible arms race unfolded. Nuclear submarines became the ultimate doomsday weapon, undetectable, unstoppable, capable of ending nations in minutes. The Soviets built the Typhoon class, the largest submarines ever constructed, carrying 20 nuclear missiles each. NATO countered with the Ohio class, quieter, deadlier, each with 24 Trident missiles. For every tank on land, there was a missile beneath the sea. For every bomber in the air, a submarine lurked in silence. This was the Cold War balance, mutual destruction guaranteed. But the arms race was not just about destruction. It was about survival, and Poland would once again find itself in the middle of NATO's desperate search for shield. NATO could never match the Soviets tank for tank, but it had something Moscow feared: technology, precision-guided bombs, advanced radar systems, fighters like the F-15 that dominated the skies, and tanks like the Leopard 2, faster, better armored, deadlier than their Soviet counterparts. For the Soviets, NATO's edge in quality meant that numbers might not guarantee victory. And as the decades wore on, NATO developed a new doctrine, one that would change the balance of power. It was called flexible response, and it meant the world had stepped even closer to nuclear Armageddon. By the 1960s, NATO abandoned massive retaliation. Instead, it embraced flexible response. If the Soviets invaded, NATO would escalate step by step, conventional defense, then tactical nukes, then full-scale nuclear war. It was meant to deter the Soviets, but in practice, it meant constant brinkmanship. Any skirmish, any border clash could escalate into a nuclear exchange. The Cuban Missile Crisis proved how thin the line was. For 13 days, the world stood on the edge of destruction. Only luck and restraint kept the missiles silent. And Poland's fields, once again, were marked as battleground ground zero. But while the Cold War seemed frozen in stalemate, cracks were forming, cracks that would eventually bring the Soviet Empire crashing down, and NATO would emerge stronger than ever. The weapons of the Cold War were built for a war that never came, but they shaped the doctrines, the fears, the alliances that still define Europe today. And as the Soviet Union collapsed, NATO would not vanish, it would expand. From 12 nations in 1949 to 32 nations today, NATO was born out of fear of Soviet tanks, but now it stretches across nearly all of Europe. How did a pact meant to defend Western Europe become the global security giant staring down Russia once again? In 1949, the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty. Article 5 was the heart. An attack on one is an attack on all. For Europeans shattered by World War II, this was more than a military deal. It was a lifeline against Stalin's expanding empire. Mini-hook. But NATO's birth immediately sparked Moscow's fury and set the stage for the Cold War's military chess game. NATO quickly militarized. U.S. nukes in Europe, fleets in the Atlantic, bases across West Germany. The Soviet response? The Warsaw Pact, signed in 1955 with Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and others under Moscow's iron grip. Europe became a fortress divided. The Fulda Gap in Germany was NATO's nightmare, the spot where Soviet tank armies could pour through. Both alliances conducted massive exercises, millions of troops, thousands of nukes on standby. But NATO had a secret weapon beyond guns and missiles: unity. The 1960s and 70s tested NATO. France, under Charles de Gaulle, pulled out of NATO's integrated command. Turkey and Greece nearly fought a war despite both being members. The US was distracted by Vietnam. Yet the alliance survived because the Soviet threat was bigger than internal disputes. And as cracks appeared in NATO, cracks were also spreading in the Soviet Empire. By the late 1980s, the Soviet economy collapsed. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Warsaw Pact dissolved in 1991. Suddenly, NATO's enemy had vanished. Many asked, does NATO still need to exist? Instead of disappearing, NATO chose a new path: expansion. NATO expansion eastward, 1990s, 2000s. Former Warsaw Pact states rushed to join NATO. Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic joined in 1999. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, once Soviet republics, joined in 2004, bringing NATO right to Russia's border. Moscow saw this as betrayal. They claimed the West had promised not to expand 1 inch eastward. Washington denied it. For Russia, every new NATO member was a dagger pointed at Moscow's heart. And Vladimir Putin would not forget this. After September 11th, NATO invoked Article 5 for the first time in history, defending the United States. Troops from Europe fought in Afghanistan alongside Americans. NATO shifted from Cold War defense to global intervention. Libya in 2011, anti-piracy missions, counterterrorism. But while NATO fought abroad, Russia was rebuilding at home. And when Russia struck in Ukraine in 2014, NATO's old mission, deterring Moscow, returned with a vengeance. Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 shocked NATO. The alliance deployed battle groups to Poland and the Baltics, the largest reinforcement since the Cold War. More nations joined. Montenegro 2017, North Macedonia 2020, Finland 2023, and Sweden 2024. From the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea, NATO now surrounds Russia on multiple fronts. But NATO's growth also made it a bigger target, and Russia has now struck back in a way that hasn't been seen in decades. NATO is now the world's most powerful military bloc. 3.5 million active troops, over 20,000 tanks, 3,500 fighter jets, a nuclear umbrella with US, UK, and French warheads. Yet its eastern flank, Poland, the Baltics, Romania, is under direct threat from Russia's drones, missiles, and troops in Belarus. And when those 19 Russian drones crossed into Polish skies, NATO was forced to ask the question it has avoided since 1949, will Article 5 be tested? NATO has evolved from a small defensive pact into the mightiest alliance in history. But now, history itself has come full circle. The Cold War never truly ended, it only went dormant. And in Poland, it may be awakening again. On a cold September night, Polish radar screens lit up. 19 Russian drones crossed the border, some shot down, others slamming into Polish fields. For the first time since World War II, foreign strikes touch Polish soil. Was it a mistake or a warning? NATO knew the answer could decide Europe's future. Polish officials confirmed 19 Russian drones launched from Belarus and Western Russia. Some destroyed by NATO's Patriot and NASAMS batteries. Others hit farmland near Lublin, only miles from civilian homes. No deaths reported, but the message was clear. Poland is no longer just a neighbor to the war in Ukraine. It is a target. For NATO, this was not just an attack on Poland. It was a test of Article 5, the red line that has held the alliance together since 1949. Belarus has become Russia's launch pad. Russian troops stationed permanently. Nuclear-capable Iskander missiles deployed. Belarusian airfields launching drones and bombers. Lukashenko calls it defensive cooperation. But for Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, it feels like a dagger pointed at their borders. And as Belarus filled with Russian troops, Poland began to fear the unthinkable, a two-front war on NATO soil. Russia's war in Ukraine is bleeding into NATO's territory. The drone strikes on Poland came only days after Russia bombarded western Ukraine near Lviv, just 40 kilometers from the Polish border. Refugee flows, weapons shipments, and NATO's own supply lines all run through Poland. To Moscow, hitting Poland's border is not an accident. It's a message. Stop arming Ukraine or Poland will pay the price. NATO's immediate response. Emergency NATO meeting in Brussels. US and UK demand a strong reaction. France and Germany urge caution, fearing escalation. Polish president declares, "Every inch of our territory will be defended. Every strike will be answered." NATO scrambles F-35s, Eurofighters, and AWACS surveillance planes across Eastern Europe. But while NATO debated, Russia moved to raise the stakes even higher. Russia's military mobilization in Belarus. Satellite images show Russian armored divisions moving into Belarus. Estimates: up to 30,000 Russian troops deployed within striking distance of Warsaw. Joint drills with Belarusian forces simulate a rapid strike into Poland's Suwałki Gap, the narrow corridor connecting Poland to the Baltic states. Military analysts warn, if Russia seizes the Suwałki Gap, NATO's Baltic allies could be cut off from the rest of Europe. The same nightmare NATO trained for in the Fulda Gap during the Cold War was now reborn in the Suwałki Gap. The US steps in. Washington furious at the drone strike. Pentagon warns Russia, "We will defend every inch of NATO." US deploys additional troops to Poland, including the 101st Airborne Division. B-52 bombers conduct flights near Kaliningrad as a show of force. But Trump faces a dilemma. Respond too weakly and NATO looks toothless. Respond too strongly and war with Russia could ignite. And as Washington weighed its options, Moscow sent another message, this time directly from Putin himself. In a televised address, Putin claims the drone incident was fabricated by NATO. Warns, any aggression against Russian forces in Belarus will be considered aggression against Russia itself. Russian nuclear forces put on heightened alert. The Cold War's nuclear shadows had returned. And once again, the world wondered, would Poland become the spark? The shadow of Ukraine. Analysts argue Russia's moves in Poland and Belarus are tied to its struggles in Ukraine. As Ukraine pushes back with Western weapons, Moscow seeks to intimidate NATO into slowing support. The strikes on Poland were both tactical, testing NATO defenses, and psychological, forcing NATO to fear escalation. But far from breaking NATO's will, the attack may have done the opposite. Mark Rutte, NATO Secretary General, this alliance is stronger and more united than ever. We will not be intimidated. NATO's Eastern members, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, demand permanent U.S. bases. Germany, long reluctant, agrees to expand its defense budget further. Sweden and Finland, now full NATO members, pledge troops for the Baltic defense. For the first time in decades, NATO is mobilizing as if war could break out tomorrow. 19 drones may not sound like the start of World War III, but in Poland, those drones shattered an illusion that NATO's borders were safe. And as Russian troops mass in Belarus, NATO faces a decision it has avoided since the Cold War: prepare for war or risk being unprepared when war begins. If NATO were a single nation, its military would dwarf every rival on Earth. But power on paper doesn't always guarantee victory, especially when facing an opponent willing to gamble everything, including nuclear war. Just how powerful is NATO, and could it really stop Russia if the Eastern Front ignites? Manpower and troops. NATO's combined forces. 3.5 million active troops and over 2 million reserves. Russia's forces. Around 1.15 million active, with recent mobilizations boosting numbers, but often poorly trained. Poland alone now fields 300,000 troops, rapidly modernizing with U.S. tanks and Korean artillery. But raw numbers don't win wars, firepower does. Tanks and ground forces. NATO's ground arsenal, over 20,000 tanks. U.S. M1A2 Abrams. German Leopard 2 A7S. British Challenger 2s. Russia still fields thousands of tanks, but many are outdated Soviet-era T-72s. Ukraine war exposed weaknesses, Russian tanks vulnerable to drones and modern anti-tank missiles. If Cold War battles were decided by tank duels, the next war may be decided by what hunts them from the sky. Air power. NATO's edge is overwhelming, over 3,500 modern fighter jets, F-35 stealth fighters, F-15s, F-16s Typhoons, Rafales. Russia, around 1,500 aircraft, but many are aging Su-27s and MiGs. NATO also controls the skies with AWACS surveillance and refueling fleets. But even NATO's skies are not untouchable. Russia's S-400 missile batteries can reach deep into Poland and beyond. Naval power. NATO navies dominate. U.S. Navy with 11 aircraft carriers. UK and France with carriers. Dozens of nuclear submarines. Russia's Navy. Weaker, but dangerous with nuclear-armed subs and Caliber cruise missiles. The Baltic and Black Seas could become flashpoints, where smaller forces clash in confined waters. But war may not begin on land or sea. It could begin in the shadows of cyberspace, cyber and hybrid warfare. NATO, advanced cyber commands, especially in the US and UK. Russia specializes in hybrid warfare, hacking, propaganda, election interference, sabotage. In a Poland conflict, Moscow may first strike NATO infrastructure, power grids, communications, satellites. In the Cold War, the fear was nuclear warheads. Today, it could be keystrokes that bring nations to their knees. Nuclear deterrence. NATO's nuclear umbrella. U.S. strategic arsenal, over 5,000 warheads. UK and France, around 500 warheads combined. Nuclear sharing. U.S. bombs stored in Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, Italy, Turkey. Russia, about 6,000 warheads, slightly more than NATO. The balance is terrifyingly close. One misstep could trigger Armageddon. And this is why every drone over Poland, every missile near Belarus, carries the weight of the unthinkable. Logistics and geography. NATO's strength is global reach, but its weakness is geography. Reinforcing the Baltics, or Poland, takes time. The Suwalki Gap is a choke point that could cut off NATO forces. U.S. tanks in Germany take days to move east. Airlifts help, but Russia is already at the border. In war, speed is survival, and Russia can strike faster than NATO can reinforce. NATO's political will. Militarily unmatched, but politically divided. Poland and the Baltics push for toughness. Trump has good relationship with Putin. France and Germany often urge restraint. Putin bets on this division, hoping one weak link breaks the chain. Because NATO is not just an army, it is a promise. And promises are only as strong as the will to keep them. On paper, NATO is unstoppable. In reality, its power depends on unity and speed. If war breaks out in Poland, the question won't be whether NATO can win, but how much it is willing to sacrifice to do so. The violations of Polish airspace by Russian drones aren't just another headline. Under President Donald Trump, they've become a test of resolve. Will the U.S. stand by its NATO pledges or signal weakness when its allies need strength? What we know now. Poland reported 19 Russian drones crossed into its airspace, some shot down with NATO support. President Trump's reaction was cautious. He called it possibly a mistake, saying, "What's with Russia violating Poland's airspace with drones?" Here we go. Poland rejected Trump's mistake theory, saying the attack was deliberate. Officials displayed drone debris as evidence. U.S. response and strategic shifts. Trump held a call with Polish President Karol Nawrocki, reaffirming solidarity. He floated sending more U.S. troops to Poland if the Polish government wants it. Trump also said his patience with Vladimir Putin is running out fast, especially over the Ukraine war. At the same time, NATO launched Operation Eastern Sentry to beef up defenses along the eastern flank. More readiness, more deployments. The dilemma Trump faces. Credibility versus restraint. If Trump acts too softly, Russia and other adversaries may interpret it as a green light. If he acts too aggressively, NATO risks escalation, possibly running toward an open conflict. Domestic pressure. Some U.S. lawmakers are already demanding tougher sanctions, more aid to Ukraine, and conclusive proof to validate Poland's case. Others urge caution, worried about cost fallout, and whether the U.S. can sustain deep engagement in both Eastern Europe and Ukraine simultaneously. Balancing diplomacy and deterrence. Trump has suggested that Russian peace negotiations should be on the table. But recent events, the drone strike, the military drills by Russia and Belarus Zapad 2025 near Poland's border are pushing him toward more hardline responses. What Trump may do next? Increase U.S. troop presence in Poland and reinforce NATO eastern flank. Impose stronger sanctions on Russia, targeting banks, oil, maybe even its drone industry. Push NATO members to raise defense spending to the new 5% of GDP target, warning them that U.S. support may be conditional on allied burden sharing. Under President Trump, the United States is no longer only reacting, it's being forced to choose. Does the U.S. defend its allies at all costs, or will strategic caution limit its action? The world is watching. The drone incursion into Poland, the Russian drills in Belarus, and the standoff across NATO's eastern border, these are not random acts. They are deliberate signals. Under President Trump, the stakes have risen. What was a Cold War strategy of containment has turned into a real war of escalation. NATO's unity, the US's resolve, and Poland's courage now stand as the tripwire for all of Europe. Because make no mistake, failure to act decisively now won't just risk Poland or Ukraine or one border. It risks the peace and freedom of all of NATO. If the U.S. and its allies do not respond with strength, deterrence, and clarity, then every inch of NATO territory becomes vulnerable, not just in theory, but in fact. What side of history will we be on? Will we stand firm with our allies, enforce our treaties, and demand accountability, or will hesitation and ambiguity hand strategic advantage to those who test us? Let me know your thoughts. Do you believe President Trump will stand strong enough, or will Russia continue pushing boundaries unchecked? If you found this dive into current events and Cold War echoes useful, hit subscribe on Battle Vault, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who needs to see it. Because understanding what's happening now could determine what the future looks like.